In the middle of the 4th century before our era, the world was not one world, but many. Across the Mediterranean, city-states of Greece argued endlessly, sometimes with words, sometimes with spears. To the south, the ancient land of Egypt was a province in decline, worn thin by centuries of foreign rule. To the east stretched the Persian Empire, vast and wealthy, its roads running farther than any traveler could follow in a lifetime. And to the north, in the hills and plains of Macedonia, a small but ambitious kingdom prepared itself for something greater. This was the world that received a child named Alexander. Few at his birth could have imagined how far he would go, or how quickly. He would inherit his father's throne while still a teenager. He would cross seas, scale mountains, and command armies that moved with the speed of weather. By the time of his death at only 32 years old, his name would echo from the shores of the Adriatic to the foothills of the Himalayas. His story is one of conquest, but also of culture. Wherever Alexander marched, he left behind not only garrisons and governors, but cities, marketplaces, and libraries. He founded more than 20 towns that bore his name, many of which became lasting centers of commerce and learning. In his wake, Greek language and art mixed with Egyptian religion, Persian administration, and Babylonian astronomy, creating a world we now call Hellenistic, a world in which borders blurred and civilizations intertwined. This is not a story told in haste. It unfolds slowly, with all the weight of memory. Tonight, we will walk through it together, from the quiet chambers of Pella, where Alexander was born, to the halls of Babylon, where he died. We will pause along the way, listening to the echoes of teachers, generals, queens, and soldiers, each leaving their own mark on the path. If sleep comes while the story moves forward, let it. History is patient, and it will wait for you when you return. It is the summer of 356 before the Common Era. The city of Pella lies quiet beneath a hot July sky. The palace, with its wide courtyards and painted colonnades, is alive with the hush of expectation. Inside its walls, Queen Olympias labors to bring a child into the world, a child whose life will stretch far beyond these stone chambers. Olympias was no ordinary queen. She came from Epirus, a rugged land of mountains and thick forests, where ancient oracles whispered through oak trees at Dodona. The people of Epirus traced their lineage back to Achilles himself, the swift-footed hero of Homer's Iliad. Olympias carried that pride within her veins, and she raised her son to believe that he, too, belonged to the blood of heroes. Later stories describe her as fiery, mystical, and deeply devoted to the gods, a woman who performed rites of Dionysus, where serpents coiled in the flickering torchlight. In a world where myth and ritual blended with politics, Olympia stood as both queen and priestess, shaping the imagination of her son from the very beginning. Her husband, King Philip II, was away when the child was born, busy securing his borders through war and diplomacy. Philip was a man of remarkable ability, scarred in body from the battles of his youth, but sharp in mind, and already reshaping Macedonia into a power that the rest of Greece could not ignore. He was not a faithful husband, nor always a gentle one, but he was a statesman of rare vision. To him, this child would be heir, student, and weapon all at once. Ancient writers, especially Plutarch, fill the night of Alexander's birth with omens. They tell us that far away in Asia Minor, The great temple of Artemis at Ephesus burned to the ground, flames rising so high they lit the sky. The priests declared it a sign that the goddess had left her shrine to witness the boy's arrival, for on that night a force was born that would one day change the world. Olympias herself dreamed of lightning striking her body. Philip dreamed of sealing his wife's womb with a lion's emblem. And in later retellings, serpents were seen coiling beside the queen, suggesting the presence of Zeus himself in her chamber. Whether these tales were inventions, exaggerations, or genuine superstitions, they gave the child a sense of destiny from the moment he took his first breath. He was named Alexandros, defender of men. It was a common enough name in Greek lands, but one that would soon belong to no other. As an infant in the palace of Pella, Alexander grew up among courtiers, soldiers, and servants. The palace itself was richly decorated, its walls painted with scenes of hunts, battles, and gods. From its windows one could see the Macedonian plains, where grain fields shimmered in the sun, and herds of horses moved like shadows across the hills. Soldiers trained in the courtyards below, their long sarissas, pikes nearly 5 meters in length, gleaming as they practiced the movements of the phalanx, the new military formation Philip had perfected. To young Alexander, the rhythm of marching feet and the sound of iron striking iron would have been as familiar as lullabies. Olympias filled his early years with religion and myth. She told him stories of Achilles, of Heracles, of heroes who were not quite gods, but more than men. She taught him that greatness was his inheritance, and that he must live not as an ordinary mortal, but as one chosen by fate. Her intensity could be overwhelming, but it gave Alexander a sense of singular purpose. Where other children might have played at soldiers, Alexander was reminded daily that he was the descendant of heroes, destined to lead. Philip, when he was present, gave lessons of a different sort. He was practical, strategic, always calculating the balance of power. He showed his son that a king must not only fight, but also negotiate, deceive, and unite. Philip had transformed Macedonia from a minor kingdom into a rising power. He had reorganized the army, taken control of gold mines that filled his treasury, and used both war and marriage to expand his influence. Watching him, Alexander learned that power was not given. It was built carefully, like a fortress of stone. The young prince grew between these two forces, his mother's fierce spirituality and his father's cold pragmatism. From Olympias, he inherited fire. From Philip, iron. The world outside Pella was turbulent. To the south, the Greek city-states, Athens, Sparta, Thebes, Corinth, had long histories of rivalry. They were proud, independent, and constantly at war with one another. The Persian Empire, vast and ancient, watched from across the sea, its satraps ruling the cities of Asia Minor. The Mediterranean itself was alive with traders, pirates, and envoys, carrying goods and stories from as far as Egypt and Carthage. Alexander, even as a child, was at the crossroads of civilizations. Evenings in the palace were filled with music. Poets recited Homer, musicians played the lyre, and philosophers debated under the torchlight. For Alexander, these were not just entertainments, but lessons. From the verses of the Iliad, he absorbed a code of honor, loyalty, and glory. He listened to the tales of Achilles and Hector, Odysseus and Agamemnon, and saw in them models for his own life. Later, he would say that Achilles was his hero, and he sought to emulate him in courage, ambition, and even in anger. The boy's education began early, with tutors teaching him letters, numbers, and the rudiments of governance. But more important than books were the impressions he gathered from the people around him. He saw Philip drill his soldiers in the courtyard, molding them into a force unlike any Greece had seen before. He saw Olympias lead sacred rites, calling on gods with the intensity of a prophetess. He saw envoys come and go, bringing gifts, demands, and news of distant lands. All of these shaped his imagination. No one could have guessed then how far the boy would go. He was small, sharp-eyed, and quick in manner. He had a restless energy, a curiosity that pulled him toward every story, every performance, every conversation. He absorbed details the way others absorbed warmth from the sun. Perhaps even then, he was already measuring himself against the world, eager to prove worthy of the legends that surrounded him. Alexander's birth was not just the arrival of a prince. It was the beginning of a new chapter in the history of the Mediterranean. The omens and prophecies may have been embroidered by later writers, but the reality was no less significant. A child was born who would inherit his father's vision, his mother's passion, and a world ready to be changed. When Alexander reached his early teenage years, Philip decided it was time to secure for his son a teacher worthy of a future king. He did not choose lightly. Among the many philosophers and thinkers of the age, he selected Aristotle, then in his late 30s, already known for his piercing intellect and for the years he had spent as a student in Plato's academy at Athens. Aristotle was brought north from his native Stagira to the Macedonian countryside, to a place called Myadza. There, in a shaded grove surrounded by gardens and streams, he established a small school. It was here that Alexander, along with a select group of other noble youths, would spend the formative years of his education. The grove at Myadza was no ordinary classroom. Lessons were not confined to halls or desks. They unfolded under the trees, along shaded paths, beside the murmur of water. In this quiet setting, Aristotle instructed the boys in philosophy, logic, ethics, natural science, politics, and literature. For Alexander, who had already been shaped by the legends of Homer, this was an opening of the mind to the vastness of the world. He studied plants and animals, learned the names of stars and constellations, practiced the art of rhetoric, and debated questions of justice and virtue. One subject held special importance: Homer's Iliad. Aristotle provided Alexander with a personal copy of the epic, one annotated with his own notes. Alexander treated it as a sacred text. He carried it with him on campaign, sometimes sleeping with it beneath his pillow alongside a dagger. Achilles, the swift-footed warrior of the Iliad, became Alexander's model of heroism. Like Achilles, Alexander longed for glory, not a long life lived in obscurity. To him, immortality meant not the survival of the body, but the endurance of one's name in song and memory. Yet Aristotle's influence extended beyond poetry. He introduced Alexander to the study of observation, of looking closely at the world rather than taking it at face value. Aristotle taught that every phenomenon, no matter how small, carried meaning. The way leaves turned toward the sun, the habits of animals, the causes of storms, the patterns of the heavens. Alexander absorbed this curiosity. Later, as he marched across Asia, he would take with him not only generals and soldiers, but also surveyors, historians, and naturalists, ensuring that his conquests also became voyages of discovery. But if Aristotle gave Alexander knowledge, he also passed on certain prejudices. He believed firmly in the superiority of Greeks over non-Greeks, and of free men over slaves. To him, the world was divided between those destined to rule and those destined to serve. Alexander listened, but would later defy this teaching. Though he would never cease to think of himself as a Greek, he would come to welcome Persians into his army, marry women of foreign nobility, and encourage his soldiers to do the same. Where Aristotle drew lines between peoples, Alexander often blurred them. Perhaps this was a rebellion against his teacher, or perhaps simply a recognition that empire cannot be built on exclusion alone. At Mieza, Alexander was not alone. He studied alongside the sons of Macedonian nobles who would become his lifelong companions. There was Hephaestion, the friend closest to his heart, often described as another Alexander in loyalty and devotion. There was Ptolemy, who would one day rule Egypt. There was Cassander, who would later become king of Macedonia, and Lysimachus, who would rule Thrace. Together they were bound not only by lessons, but by the shared experience of youth, friendship, and the sense that they were being prepared for something far greater than themselves. The education at Mieza did not make Alexander a philosopher, but it gave him an enduring respect for knowledge and for those who pursued it. Unlike many conquerors, he sought not only victory in battle, but also understanding of the lands he entered. He respected poets, rewarded scholars, and carried books with him even when he carried little else. And though he often acted with ruthless ambition, there remained within him the imprint of those early days in the grove, the belief that leadership was not merely a matter of force, but also of vision, of knowing the world in order to command it. By the time Alexander left Mieza, he was no longer only a boy listening to stories of heroes. He was a young man who believed that he might himself be destined to join their ranks. He had learned to see the world as a place vast, varied, and open to those bold enough to step across its borders. What Aristotle gave him was not only knowledge, but the confidence to treat the world itself as a book to be read, a puzzle to be solved, and, ultimately, a realm to be conquered. Among the many tales told about Alexander's youth, one stands above the rest. It is the story of a boy and a horse, a story so often repeated by ancient writers that it became less a memory than a parable. On its surface, it is simple. A young prince tames a wild animal. But beneath that surface lies a symbol of leadership, of perception, and of destiny. The scene is set in the palace court at Pella. The air is bright with late afternoon sunlight, the kind that throws long shadows across the stone colonnades and makes bronze fittings gleam like fire. Macedonian nobles, generals, and attendants gather around a great black horse brought in from Thessaly, a region famous throughout Greece for its breeders. The Thessalian horses were prized above all others, strong-shouldered, deep-chested, swift, and enduring. To own such a horse was to possess not only a means of war, but also a mark of prestige. King Philip had paid a heavy price for this one. Its name was Bucephalus, ox-headed, perhaps because of its broad forehead, perhaps because of the blunt shape of its nose. The animal was large, dark, and muscular, with a wild glint in its eye. The courtiers watched as groom after groom attempted to mount him. Each time Bucephalus reared, bucked, and fought. The dust of the courtyard rose around them. Some men were nearly thrown. Others gave up quickly, shaking their heads and laughing at the folly of paying so much for a beast that could not be tamed. Philip himself grew impatient. Horses were valuable, yes, but this one seemed more trouble than it was worth. "Take it away," he said to have muttered, unwilling to waste more time. It was then that Alexander, barely into his teens, stepped forward. He had been watching intently, eyes narrowed, not with amusement, but with curiosity. While the men around him dismissed the horse as unrideable, Alexander had noticed something. Each time Bucephalus was led into the open, he shied not at the men, nor at the reins, but at the ground in front of him. His great body twisted away from something only he seemed to see. Alexander realized the truth. The horse was afraid of its own shadow. He declared boldly to his father that the horse could indeed be tamed. The courtiers laughed, some in mockery, others in disbelief. What could a boy accomplish when trained horsemen had failed? But Alexander insisted, and Philip, curious to see whether the boy's confidence was mere arrogance, allowed him the chance. The young prince approached Bucephalus with calm steps. He took the reins and gently turned the horse toward the sun, so that the shadow now fell behind rather than before him. The animal snorted and stamped, but its terror was eased. Alexander spoke softly, stroked its neck, and then, with a quick and fluid motion, mounted. For a moment the courtyard held its breath. Then the horse leapt forward, galloping across the plain outside the palace. Dust rose behind them in a long plume. The boy and the animal moved together, as if they had been paired all their lives. When at last Alexander returned, bringing Bucephalus under control before the astonished eyes of the court, Philip's reaction wasn't laughter, but a solemn pride. Plutarch, writing centuries later, records his words, "My boy, you must find a kingdom great enough for your ambitions. Macedonia is too small for you." It was more than a compliment. It was a prophecy, spoken in the flush of pride, but remembered ever after as a foreshadowing of what was to come. Bucephalus became Alexander's companion for nearly 2 decades. Through battles, sieges, and long marches, the horse carried him further than any Macedonian had ever traveled. They crossed the mountains of Anatolia, the deserts of Syria, the plains of Mesopotamia, the valleys of Bactria, and the rivers of India. The bond between them was not only practical, but almost legendary, the kind of partnership that ancient cultures loved to celebrate. Just as Achilles had his immortal horses, Xanthus and Balius, Alexander had Bucephalus, mortal, but no less enduring in memory. When the horse finally died, after the Battle of the Hydaspes in India, Alexander was inconsolable. He ordered an entire city founded in his honor, Bucephala, so that the animal's name would be remembered for generations. In an age where cities were often dedicated to gods or kings, the naming of a city for a horse spoke volumes about the depth of Alexander's affection and respect. But the significance of the story does not end there. To the Greeks, horses were more than animals. They were symbols of nobility, wealth, and control. Unlike goats or sheep, which could be owned by any farmer, horses were rare and costly to maintain. They required stables, fodder, and careful training. To master a horse was to demonstrate mastery over nature, over status, and over the chaos of untamed energy. For a young prince to tame such an animal in front of the court was not just a feat of skill. It was a claim to legitimacy, to vision, and to leadership. We must also consider how the story was remembered. Writers like Plutarch, Arrian, and Diodorus were not eyewitnesses. They lived centuries later, drawing on earlier sources now lost to us. They shaped Alexander's life into episodes that carried meaning, episodes that explained how such a man could come to be. The taming of Bucephalus was one such episode, a single event made to stand for an entire character. To them, it was not about whether every detail was true, but about what it revealed, that Alexander saw differently, that he understood fear and how to master it, and that from boyhood he was already acting like a king. Consider, too, what this moment meant in the broader context of Macedonian culture. The cavalry was the pride of Philip's army, especially the companion cavalry, the elite unit that would ride into the thickest of battles beside Alexander himself. Horses were not merely tools of war, but emblems of the Macedonian way of fighting. By taming Bucephalus, Alexander was symbolically mastering the very arm of the military that would define his campaigns. It was as if fate itself had arranged a rehearsal, long before the wars began. And what of Bucephalus's fear of shadows? There is something almost poetic in this detail. A beast undone not by enemy spears, nor by the strength of men, but by the sight of its own darkness cast upon the ground. Alexander's genius lay in recognizing this, in understanding that true mastery does not always mean overwhelming force. Sometimes it means insight, the ability to see what others miss. Later in life, he would apply this same perception to battlefields, to politics, and to people. Where others saw obstacles, he saw openings. Where others saw chaos, he found order. Just as he turned the horse toward the sun, he would turn his armies toward opportunity. The scene at Pella became legend, not only because it revealed something about Alexander, but because it revealed something about leadership itself. The crowd had laughed at the boy, dismissing him as overconfident. The men had failed where he succeeded, but he had the courage to step forward, the patience to observe carefully, and the wisdom to act differently. These are the qualities that separate the ordinary from the extraordinary. And in this story, we glimpse them for the first time in the boy who would be called great. In the years that followed, as Alexander grew into command, courtiers and companions would remember that afternoon, when he issued orders that seemed reckless, when he pursued visions that seemed impossible. They must have recalled how he once mounted a horse that no one else could ride. It was more than a story. It was a reminder that with Alexander, the impossible often became real. Thus Bucephalus was not only a horse, and the taming not only an anecdote. It was a symbol woven into the very fabric of Alexander's legend, a first act in a play that would stretch across continents, a sign that this young prince was destined to master not only beasts, but empires. By the time Alexander was entering his later teenage years, his father Philip II stood as one of the most powerful men in Greece. This was no small accomplishment. When Philip had first taken the throne decades earlier, Macedonia was little more than a vulnerable border kingdom, dismissed by the great city-states to the south as half-barbarian, rough, and unrefined. Yet Philip transformed it. Through years of reform, conquest, and cunning diplomacy, He built a military machine unlike any the Greek world had ever seen. At the center of his success was the phalanx, rows upon rows of infantrymen carrying sarissas, pikes so long that they could keep enemy forces at a distance, presenting a wall of spear points that seemed impenetrable. He drilled his men with relentless discipline, ensuring they could maneuver as a single body, shifting and wheeling with precision. Alongside them rode the companion cavalry, the aristocratic horsemen who would thunder into the gaps created by the phalanx. With this army, Philip subdued neighboring tribes, expanded Macedonia's borders, and forced the proud Greek polis, Athens, Thebes, Corinth, into reluctant submission. Philip was not only a soldier, but a statesman. He married strategically, forging alliances through the bonds of family. Olympias was one of these marriages, linking Macedonia with Epirus. Others followed, each chosen to strengthen his position. Yet this web of unions created tension within the palace. Olympias, fiercely protective of her son Alexander, watched with suspicion as Philip took new wives and fathered new children. Court factions formed, each with their own loyalties and ambitions. For Alexander, this was a world of both opportunity and danger. He was recognized as his father's heir, yet he could never forget that rivals circled close. He trained with the army, led small detachments into battle, and proved himself capable, but he also clashed with Philip. At one banquet, after harsh words were exchanged, Alexander is said to have left the hall in anger, taking Olympias with him into temporary exile. Reconciliation followed, but the tension between father and son never fully disappeared. Then came the event that would change everything. In 336 BCE, Philip prepared to launch his grand campaign against the Persian Empire. He had secured the allegiance of the Greek states through the League of Corinth, presenting himself not as conqueror, but as leader of a united Hellenic crusade to avenge past Persian invasions. The plan was ambitious: to cross the Aegean with an army, march into Asia Minor, and strike at the satrapies of the great king. It was the culmination of years of preparation. But before the expedition could begin, Philip was assassinated. The setting was a grand wedding celebration in Aegae, one of Macedonia's ancient capitals. Crowds filled the theater. Diplomats, generals, and nobles gathered, all in high spirits. Among them was a man named Pausanias, one of Philip's bodyguards. As Philip entered the theater, dressed in white robes and unaccompanied by his guards, perhaps as a display of confidence, perhaps as a show of humility before the gods, Pausanias rushed forward and struck him down with a dagger. The king collapsed, blood staining the stones, and chaos erupted. Pausanias was killed almost immediately by Philip's companions, but the damage was done. Philip II, builder of Macedonia's power, architect of the Persian campaign, was dead. He was around 46 years old. His body was carried away, and his throne suddenly lay vacant. The motives of the assassin remain debated even now. Some claimed it was a personal grievance. Pausanias, insulted by court politics and seeking revenge. Others whispered of conspiracy. Could Olympias have been involved, hoping to secure her son's succession? Did Alexander himself know of the plot, or was he as shocked as the rest? Historians disagree. What is certain is that the assassination removed, in an instant, the one figure standing between Alexander and the throne. The court was thrown into turmoil. Factions rose. Some nobles may have hoped to seize power for themselves or to place another of Philip's children on the throne. But Alexander acted with speed and decisiveness. At only 20 years old, he asserted his claim as king. He had been raised in the shadow of Philip's greatness, trained in war, schooled in leadership, and prepared by Olympius to believe in his destiny. Now, with his father gone, he moved to secure what was his. His first acts were ruthless. Potential rivals were eliminated. Carinus, a half-brother, was killed. Amyntas, another possible heir, was executed. The noblemen who might oppose him were forced into submission or removed entirely. Even Cleopatra Eurydice, Philip's most recent wife, and her infant daughter met tragic ends. Olympias herself said to have orchestrated their deaths. It was a bloody consolidation of power, swift and merciless. The kind of act that often marked the transition of kingship in the ancient world. Once the throne was secure, Alexander turned his attention outward. News of Philip's death spread quickly across Greece, and many cities saw their chance to break free from Macedonian control. Thebes and Athens, remembering old grievances, stirred restlessly. Thracian tribes to the north tested the borders. The new king had to prove that he was not merely Philip's boy, but a ruler in his own right. He moved with remarkable speed. Marching north, he secured the loyalty of the Thracians through force and diplomacy. Turning south, he entered Greece with an army, reminding the city-states of the iron reality of Macedonian power. In Thebes, rebellion broke out. The Thebans miscalculated, assuming that Alexander, young and untested, would not act decisively. They were wrong. In a lightning campaign, Alexander besieged the city, broke through its defenses, and ordered its destruction. Thebes, proud city of myth and tragedy, was reduced to rubble. 6,000 were killed, 30,000 sold into slavery. Only temples and the house of the poet Pindar were spared. The brutality shocked Greece, but it also achieved its purpose. Other cities, terrified, abandoned thoughts of rebellion and reaffirmed their allegiance. Athens, too, submitted, choosing diplomacy over ruin. Alexander had made his point. He was not a boy clinging to his father's legacy. He was a king, and a dangerous one. The path was now clear. With Greece subdued, the army loyal, and rivals crushed, Alexander could take up the mantle his father had left behind. The invasion of Persia would go forward, but now under a different leader. Where Philip had planned to march as the commander of a united Greece, Alexander would march as its conqueror, carrying not only the ambitions of his father, but his own hunger for glory. In this moment, the shadow of Philip finally lifted. For years, Alexander had lived beneath the towering figure of a father whose achievements seemed impossible to match. But with Philip's death and Alexander's ruthless consolidation of power, the sun stepped out from that shadow. The kingdom was his, and the world beyond the Aegean lay waiting. In the spring of 334 BCE, Alexander stood on the shores of the Hellespont, the narrow strait that separated Europe from Asia. For centuries, this stretch of water, known today as the Dardanelles, had been a boundary between worlds. To the Greeks, the lands across the strait were the edge of the Persian Empire, a vast dominion stretching eastward farther than imagination could follow. To cross it was to leave behind the familiar cities and landscapes of Greece and Macedonia, and to step into the realm of myth and empire. The expedition had been long in preparation. Philip had first envisioned it, a grand campaign to punish Persia for the invasions of a century and a half earlier, when Xerxes' armies had burned Athens, and when Marathon, Salamis, and Plataea had become the stuff of legend. Alexander inherited both the plan and the army to carry it out. But what had been Philip's strategic design was for his son also a personal mission. Where Philip had thought in terms of power, Alexander thought in terms of glory. The army that gathered with him numbered around 37,000 men, 30,000 infantry, and a little more than 5,000 cavalry. By Persian standards, it was a small force, hardly more than an expeditionary corps. Yet it was a highly disciplined, battle-hardened army, drilled in the tactics of the Macedonian phalanx and the thunder of the companion cavalry. They were supported by engineers, siege specialists, supply officers, and even historians and surveyors. For Alexander intended not only to conquer, but to record and reshape the lands he entered. Crossing the Hellespont was no simple logistical exercise. It carried immense symbolic weight. Nearly a century and a half earlier, Xerxes, king of Persia, had crossed the same waters with an enormous army to invade Greece. Now, in a reversal of history, a Greek king, or rather, a Macedonian king leading a coalition of Greeks, would cross in the opposite direction, bringing war into Asia. It was a gesture of vengeance, of reversal, and of audacity. The fleet, provided by allies like Athens, carried the army across in stages. Alexander himself, according to the stories, sailed aboard a sacred ship, perhaps modeled after the vessel of Theseus. He was not content to simply cross. He sought to transform the passage into a ritual. When his ship reached the Asian shore, he leapt onto the land fully armed, spear in hand. He thrust the weapon into the soil and declared Asia spear-won land, claiming it not merely by right of kingship, but by the act of conquest itself. The gesture echoed old customs of taking possession and announced to his men and to the gods that he had come not as visitor, but as master. Before advancing further, Alexander made a pilgrimage to the plain of Troy. To the Greeks, Troy was more than a ruin. It was the setting of Homer's Iliad, the poem that had shaped their imagination for centuries. Alexander, who carried Homer's verses like scripture, sought to walk in the footsteps of his hero Achilles. He offered sacrifices at the tomb of the great warrior, hung a garland upon his grave, and ran a race in his honor. To his closest companion, Hephaestion, he gave a similar role, to honor the tomb of Patroclus, Achilles' dearest friend. The symbolism was clear. Alexander cast himself as the new Achilles, with Hephaestion as his Patroclus, their bond echoing that of the Homeric pair. The visit to Troy was more than mere piety. It was theater, staged for his men and for history itself. By linking his campaign to the Trojan War, Alexander framed his invasion not as naked conquest, but as continuation of a heroic saga. To fight Persia was not simply to gain territory. It was to avenge ancient wrongs, to outshine the heroes of legend, and to carve his own name into the epic tradition of Greece. From Troy, the army marched eastward into Asia Minor. Their first challenge came at the Granicus River, where a force of Persian satraps, provincial governors, had gathered to block their way. But before that battle, the crossing itself remained the moment of transformation. When Alexander's boots touched Asian soil, the course of history shifted. He was no longer the boy who had tamed Bucephalus, nor the young king who had destroyed Thebes. He was a conqueror stepping onto foreign ground, beginning a march that would carry him across continents. The symbolism was not lost on his men. For many, it was the first time they had left the world they knew. Behind them lay the vineyards of Macedonia, the bustling agora of Athens, the sacred games of Olympia. Ahead of them lay unknown lands, strange peoples, new gods, and unimaginable riches. They crossed not only a stretch of water, but the threshold into legend. Later writers, looking back, would invest this crossing with the weight of destiny. Arrian, writing in the 2nd century CE, imagined Alexander casting his spear into Asia as a conqueror claiming his prize. Plutarch emphasized his homage to Achilles, a gesture of both piety and ambition. To them, the moment stood as the true beginning of Alexander's greatness. It is easy, centuries later, to reduce such events to mere anecdotes, polished smooth by repetition. But if we linger for a moment, we can imagine the reality: the creak of ships on the strait, the flapping of sails, the calls of oarsmen as they pulled in rhythm across the currents. Soldiers crowded the decks, their armor glinting in the sun, their faces anxious or eager. Horses were ferried on rafts, stamping nervously as the waters shifted beneath them. Supply carts, siege engines, and baggage animals all had to be transported in careful order. The crossing was not the work of a single leap, but of hours, perhaps days, of labor. And yet, when Alexander set foot on the Asian shore, all of that effort condensed into a single symbolic act. The campaign had begun. For the Persians, news of his arrival was cause for alarm, but not panic. To them, Alexander was still a young upstart, the son of Philip, leading a relatively small force. Persia was vast, wealthy, and experienced in the art of empire. Its satraps had faced Greek incursions before, and though some had ended in trouble, none had threatened the heart of the empire. But what they didn't yet understand was that this young king was unlike any invader they had faced. He carried not only weapons, but vision, and he would not turn back until the world itself seemed too small for him. So it was that in the spring of 334 BCE, Alexander crossed the Hellespont. The waters that had once divided Greece and Persia now carried him across. What had once been the route of invasion into Greece became, in reverse, the path of retribution. It was the first step in a march that would alter the balance of the ancient world forever. When Alexander set foot in Asia, he knew he would be tested quickly. The Persians, though surprised by the speed of his crossing, were not unprepared. The western provinces of the empire, called satrapies, were under the command of governors who had already faced Greek armies in the past. They gathered their cavalry and infantry, summoning forces from Lydia, Phrygia, and beyond. The first point of confrontation came at the Granicus River, a swift-flowing stream in northwestern Asia Minor, not far from the ancient city of Troy. The satraps chose their ground carefully. They knew the Macedonians would have to cross the river to advance inland, and so they arrayed their forces on the opposite bank. Their cavalry, heavily armored nobles on fine horses, lined the river's edge, while infantry, including Greek mercenaries hired into Persian service, stood in reserve behind them. Their plan was simple: to strike Alexander's men as they struggled through the water, disrupting their formations before they could reach firm ground. For the Macedonians, the position was daunting. The river was not broad, but its banks were steep and its currents swift. To cross under fire meant exposing themselves to missiles, charges, and the chaos of uneven footing. Some of Alexander's officers advised caution. The day was late, they said. Why not wait until morning, when the river might be forded more easily, and the men could rest? But Alexander rejected hesitation. He believed that delay would sap momentum and embolden the enemy. To his mind, boldness was the surest path to victory. He gave the order. They would attack at once. The army prepared for battle. The Macedonian phalanx, the heart of Philip's military reforms, stretched across the line. Each man carried a sarissa, a pike twice the length of a normal spear, its tip gleaming in the afternoon sun. Behind them, the companion cavalry readied themselves. These were not ordinary horsemen. They were the aristocratic elite of Macedonia, bound by loyalty to their king, trained to charge in disciplined wedges that could pierce through enemy lines. Alexander placed himself among them, at the right wing, the traditional position of honor in Greek warfare. He wore a plumed helmet, gleaming armor, and carried a lance. To his men, he was more than a commander. He was a symbol, a figure to follow into the most dangerous ground. As the trumpet sounded, the Macedonian cavalry splashed into the river. The water rose against the flanks of the horses, the current tugged at their legs, and missiles whistled down from the Persian line. Arrows hissed into the water, javelins struck shields and armor. Horses stumbled on the slippery stones of the riverbed. Yet the companions pressed forward, spears leveled, voices raised in their battle cry. The clash at the riverbank was fierce. The Persians, positioned above, had the advantage of height. Their cavalry thrust downward into the struggling Macedonians, and for a moment it seemed the river itself was a weapon, pushing back the attackers. But Alexander had planned carefully. He ordered feints and diversions along the line, forcing the Persians to spread their strength. Then, gathering his companions, he struck directly where the enemy concentration was strongest. It was here that Alexander displayed his trademark style. To lead from the front, to plunge into the thick of combat where the danger was greatest. With his lance lowered, he rode at the Persian nobles, seeking not merely to scatter them, but to challenge their commanders face to face. Ancient accounts tell us he confronted the satraps in person, killing several with his own hand. His presence was electrifying. Where their king fought, the Macedonians surged, driven by both loyalty and pride. At one point, Alexander himself was nearly struck down. A Persian noble, Spithridates, raised his weapon to deliver a fatal blow. Another, Rhusaxes, slashed at him with a sword, breaking through his helmet. But at the last moment, Cletus the Black, one of Alexander's trusted officers, cut Spithridates down, saving the young king's life. The incident showed how close victory and death could lie together on the battlefield, and how much Alexander's fate depended not only on his courage, but on the devotion of those around him. Gradually, the tide turned. The Persians, unable to break the Macedonian formation in the water, began to give way. Once the companions gained firm ground on the far bank, their discipline and momentum carried them forward. The long pikes of the phalanx pressed up behind them, adding weight to the assault. Persian cavalry, proud and glittering in their armor, began to fall back in disorder. When the cavalry broke, the Greek mercenaries fighting for Persia were left exposed. These were seasoned men, many of them veterans of earlier wars, hired by Persian gold to fight against their fellow Greeks. Alexander turned his attention to them. Surrounded and pressed by the Macedonian phalanx, they fought bravely, but the outcome was inevitable. Thousands were cut down where they stood. Of the survivors, many were taken captive. Alexander, in a display both political and ruthless, sent them in chains to forced labor in Macedonia. To him, they were traitors to the Hellenic cause, men who had sold their swords to Persia against their own kin. By punishing them publicly, he made clear that his campaign was not only a war of conquest, but a crusade for Greek honor, at least in the narrative he wished to tell. The victory at the Granicus was complete. The Persian satraps had failed to stop him at the border. Their cavalry was shattered, their mercenaries destroyed, their provinces left exposed. Alexander had not only crossed into Asia, he had secured his foothold with blood and steel. The cost to the Macedonians was not light. Hundreds fell in the river, cut down in the difficult crossing, yet the triumph outweighed the losses. News of the victory spread quickly. Cities along the coast of Asia Minor, long resentful of Persian rule, now looked to Alexander as a liberator. Sardis, the wealthy capital of Lydia, opened its gates to him without resistance. Other cities soon followed, either surrendering or preparing for siege. The Battle of the Granicus was, in many ways, a small engagement compared to the titanic struggles to come. But its significance was immense. It was Alexander's first battle against Persia, his first demonstration that boldness could overcome numbers, and his first claim to the loyalty of the Greeks as avenger of past wrongs. It set the tone for everything that followed. From this moment, there was no turning back. He had crossed the Hellespont not merely as an invader, but as a conqueror. Later writers would look back at Granicus as the opening note in the symphony of Alexander's campaigns. It revealed his recklessness, his brilliance, his willingness to risk everything at the front of his men. It also revealed the devotion of his companions, who saved him from death when fortune wavered. In that river clash, soaked in mud and blood, the legend of Alexander in Asia truly began. After his victory at the Granicus, Alexander advanced deeper into Asia Minor. One city after another opened its gates to him. Sardis surrendered, its treasures and its citadel falling into Macedonian hands. Ephesus welcomed him as a liberator, replacing Persian rule with local autonomy. Miletus resisted and endured siege. Halicarnassus fought stubbornly, but the tide of Persian power in western Anatolia had begun to ebb. By the following spring, Alexander had pushed inland, away from the coastal satrapies, into the rugged heartland of Phrygia. It was there, in the city of Gordium, that he encountered a story older than his campaign, a legend woven into the very identity of the region. Gordium was no ordinary town. It was the ancient capital of Phrygia, a kingdom remembered in Greek lore for its music, its myths, and its wealth. The Phrygians had once been mighty, and though by Alexander's time their power had faded, their legends remained strong. Chief among them was the story of a king named Gordius, a poor farmer who, guided by prophecy, had once ridden into the city on an ox cart and been proclaimed king. According to the tradition, Gordius dedicated his cart to Zeus and tied it to a post in the citadel with a knot so intricate that no one could find its ends. Over time, the knot became more than just a curiosity. It was said that whoever could undo it would rule all of Asia. For generations, visitors had come to examine it, tugging and puzzling, but none had succeeded. The knot, made of cornel bark, was so tightly wound, so cunningly wrapped, that it defied all attempts. It was not just a tangle of wood and rope, it was a riddle, a challenge preserved by time and guarded by prophecy. When Alexander entered Gordium in 333 BCE, the story of the knot was already centuries old. He visited the citadel, and there, in the dim light of the shrine, saw the cart and the rope still bound fast around the post. The air must have been heavy with incense, the whispers of attendants reminding him of the prophecy. For a king who carried Homer's verses in his breast and who saw himself as heir to Achilles, this was no mere puzzle. It was a test set by fate. Accounts differ on what happened next. Arrian, one of Alexander's later biographers, insists that the king sought out the ends of the knot and, finding them hidden, managed to loosen it legitimately. Plutarch, more dramatic, tells us that Alexander, frustrated, drew his sword and sliced through the knot with a single stroke. "It makes no difference how it is undone," he is said to have remarked. Whether by patience or by steel, the result was the same. The knot was severed, the prophecy fulfilled. The act electrified his men. Here was proof, they believed, that their king was chosen by destiny, marked by the gods to conquer Asia. It was theater, yes, but theater with immense power. By cutting the knot, Alexander showed not only boldness, but decisiveness. Where others hesitated, he acted. Where others puzzled, he created his own solution. The message was clear. Obstacles, no matter how ancient or revered, would not stand in his way. But the story also reveals something deeper about Alexander's character. He was not afraid to rewrite the rules. To the Greeks, respect for tradition and ritual was essential. To simply cut the knot could have been seen as impious, a violation of sacred custom. Yet Alexander's genius lay in transforming the act into a new kind of fulfillment. By declaring that cutting was as good as untying, he reshaped the meaning of the prophecy itself. He hadn't broken the legend. He had claimed it for his own. The symbolism of the knot ran far beyond Gordium. In many cultures, knots represented binding and release, fate and freedom. To untie a knot was to solve a mystery, to unlock destiny. By severing it, Alexander declared himself master, not only of armies, but of fate itself. It was a performance of power, one that resonated far beyond Phrygia. The aftermath of the act was just as important as the act itself. The tale of the Gordian knot spread quickly through his army and across Asia. It became a story repeated by soldiers at campfires, by envoys in their reports, by poets shaping the new legend of Alexander. In cutting the knot, the young king had woven himself into myth. He was no longer just the conqueror of cities and rivers. He was the man destined by prophecy to rule the continent. We should pause to imagine the scene in its human details. The citadel at Gordium was ancient, its stones weathered by centuries. The cart of Gordius stood like a relic, its wood dark with age, its rope brittle yet unyielding. Around it gathered Macedonian soldiers, priests of Zeus, local townspeople and courtiers. They watched as their king examined the knot, perhaps with a furrowed brow, perhaps with a gleam of amusement. They saw him try, fail, and then, whether by clever discovery or by sharp blade, unravel the mystery in an instant. A collective gasp must have risen, followed by cheers, as men realized they had witnessed not just an act, but the fulfillment of a prophecy. It was, in truth, a small moment. No blood spilled, no walls stormed, no empire toppled. And yet it carried a weight equal to any battle. For armies fight not only with weapons, but with belief. And at Gordium, Alexander gave his men a story they could carry in their hearts. To march under a king favored by prophecy was to march with destiny itself at one's side. For Alexander, the Gordian knot was one more step in the crafting of his own legend. He had been raised by Olympius to believe he was touched by the gods. He had been taught by Aristotle to think in terms of causes and meanings. He had been inspired by Homer to live a life worthy of poetry. At Gordium, all of these strands came together. With a single act, he bound himself to the great chain of myth, placing his own life alongside those of heroes. And so the army left Phrygia with more than supplies and territory. They left with a sense of inevitability. Ahead lay Darius, the great king of Persia, with his vast resources and countless troops. But behind them lay a knot, cut cleanly in two, and a prophecy that seemed already fulfilled. For men on campaign, weary and uncertain, such things mattered as much as rations or coin. Belief fed courage, and courage won battles. The Gordian knot remains, even today, one of the most enduring images of Alexander's life. Historians still debate whether he cut it or untied it, whether the story was true or embroidered. But in a sense, it hardly matters. What matters is that the story was told, and that it captured the essence of Alexander, a man who refused to be bound by tradition, who turned every obstacle into opportunity, and who carried himself as if the world itself were waiting to be claimed. After the victory at the Granicus River and the symbolic triumph at Gordium, Alexander's campaign moved steadily along the coastline of Asia Minor. His strategy was not merely to march inland, but to secure the ports and cities that dotted the Aegean shore. For as long as Persia controlled the sea with its powerful navy, Alexander's supply lines were vulnerable. To neutralize that threat, he needed the cities, their harbors, their shipyards, their grain stores. One of the most formidable among them was Halicarnassus. Halicarnassus lay in Caria, in southwestern Asia Minor, a region of rugged terrain and wealthy coastal settlements. It was a city of beauty and significance. Its most famous landmark was the Mausoleum of Mausolus, a massive tomb built for a Carian satrap decades earlier, a structure so grand that it would later be counted among the 7 wonders of the ancient world. The city itself sat on a bay, its walls rising strong and high, its harbors deep enough to house fleets. To capture Halicarnassus was to take both a jewel and a strategic stronghold. Defending it was a man unlike the Persian satraps Alexander had faced before. Memnon of Rhodes was a Greek, but he had long served Persia with skill and loyalty. He was seasoned, shrewd, and patient, and he understood that Alexander's true vulnerability was not in battle, but in supply. Memnon's advice to the Persians, given before Granicus, had been to avoid direct confrontation and instead scorch the earth, denying Alexander provisions while striking at his lines of communication. The Persians had not heeded him then, but now, in Halicarnassus, he had his chance to prove his worth. Alexander approached with his army in the late summer of 334 BCE. He had already swept through much of Western Asia Minor, liberating Greek cities from Persian rule and winning over populations eager to be rid of satraps. But Halicarnassus, fortified and determined, would not open its gates. Memnon commanded not only the city's defenders, but also a Persian fleet offshore, ready to resupply and reinforce the siege. For Alexander, the challenge was formidable. The Macedonians set about their work with practiced skill. Engineers constructed siege towers, massive wooden structures rolled on wheels, taller than the city walls and bristling with artillery. They built battering rams, covered by sheds to shield the men inside from arrows and fire. They dug trenches and erected palisades, slowly tightening the ring around the city. Day after day, the sound of hammering, sawing, and shouted orders filled the air. For the soldiers, it was grueling labor as much as combat. But the Macedonians had become adept at sieges under Philip and knew the patience required. Memnon responded with equal determination. His men launched sorties, sudden attacks out of the gates to burn the siege engines and harass the workers. At night, they sallied forth with torches, setting wooden towers ablaze and retreating before the Macedonians could catch them. Arrows rained down from the walls, and defenders hurled stones and jars of pitch that exploded into fire. The city's defenders knew they could not hold forever, but they aimed to cost Alexander dearly, to bleed him of men, time, and morale. The struggle dragged on for weeks. Each advance by the Macedonians was met by a counter from Memnon. One night, the defenders launched a particularly fierce assault, burning many of the siege towers and nearly breaking through Alexander's lines. Only with difficulty did the Macedonians repel them, fighting in the flicker of firelight, the city's walls glowing red against the night sky. It was a reminder that siege warfare was not merely engineering, but constant vigilance, for the enemy could erupt without warning. In the end, Halicarnassus could not be held. Despite Memnon's cleverness, the Persian fleet could not resupply indefinitely, and the Macedonian pressure mounted. Portions of the city were set ablaze, either by the defenders themselves in retreat or by Macedonian assault. The mausoleum and other great structures survived, but much of Halicarnassus was left in ruins. Memnon, refusing to die in a hopeless defense, withdrew with his men to the islands offshore, where the Persian fleet would carry on the fight another day. For Alexander, the fall of Halicarnassus was both a victory and a warning. He had taken the city, secured Caria, and shown that even the strongest Persian fortresses could not resist him. Yet Memnon had escaped, and his strategy of harassing Alexander's supply lines remained a threat. In fact, Memnon would soon carry the war into the Aegean, urging cities to revolt and attempting to strike at Alexander's homeland. Though fate, and Memnon's sudden death, would prevent those plans from succeeding, the danger he posed was real. The siege also revealed something about Alexander himself. Unlike some conquerors, he didn't raze Halicarnassus utterly. He left its satrapy in the hands of Ada, a local Carian queen who had been deposed by the Persians. Ada adopted Alexander formally as her son, and in return, he restored her to power. It was a gesture both practical and symbolic. Practical, because it secured the loyalty of Caria. Symbolic, because it showed that Alexander could rule not only by destruction, but by alliance. For the soldiers, the siege was a test of endurance, a reminder that conquest was not always swift charges and open battles. It meant long nights, heavy labor, the constant threat of fire and arrows from unseen hands. It meant patience, a quality not always easy to sustain in a campaign meant to move quickly. Yet by persevering, they had added another stone to the foundation of their king's legend. When the smoke cleared and Halicarnassus lay broken, the road into the interior of Asia Minor opened wider. Alexander had not only defeated armies in the field, but proven that walls, however strong, couldn't hold him back. For the Persians, it was another loss in a growing pattern, a sign that this young king couldn't be stopped by ordinary means. For the Macedonians, it was a story to tell at campfires, how they had taken the city by the sea, how the enemy had burned his own walls rather than surrender, and how their king had marched on, undeterred. The siege of Halicarnassus does not always occupy the place in memory that Gaugamela or Tyre does, but in its day, it was a vital step. It was the moment Alexander proved he could not only win swift victories in battle, but endure the long grind of attrition. It was a test of patience, engineering, and resolve. And as his army marched on into Asia, leaving Halicarnassus smoking behind them, they did so with the knowledge that no fortress could keep them out for long. By the year 332 BCE, Alexander had secured most of Asia Minor. He had marched inland, cut the Gordian knot, and taken Halicarnassus. The satraps of the western provinces had either submitted or been crushed. Now the campaign turned south along the coast of Phoenicia. To advance into Egypt and deeper into the Persian Empire, Alexander needed control of the eastern Mediterranean ports. So long as the Persian fleet had safe harbors, his rear would never be secure. Each coastal city, each harbor, had to be brought under his hand. Among them all, none was more important or more defiant than Tyre. Tyre was not simply a city. It was the greatest stronghold of the Phoenicians, heirs of a seafaring tradition older than Greece itself. The Tyrians had sailed the length of the Mediterranean, trading cedar, glass, and purple dye, founding colonies as far west as Carthage. Their ships were renowned, their sailors unmatched. Even in Alexander's day, Tyre's wealth and influence were legendary. The city itself was formidable. Old Tyre stood on the mainland, but centuries earlier the Tyrians had shifted their strength to an island about half a mile offshore. There, surrounded by the sea, they built high walls rising sheer from the water's edge, some nearly 150 feet tall. The island bristled with towers and battlements. Its harbors sheltered fleets. To besiege Tyre was not to storm ordinary walls, but to confront an island fortress, a citadel rising out of the waves. When Alexander arrived, he demanded the city's surrender. The Tyrians refused. They were willing to recognize his authority in a token way, but they would not admit his troops, nor abandon their Persian alliance. Secure behind their walls, supplied by their fleet, they believed themselves beyond his reach. Alexander, however, would not accept defiance. To leave Tyre unconquered was to leave a dagger at his back, and so he resolved to take it, a task that seemed impossible to many of his men. The city lay across the sea. The Persian navy still prowled nearby. Yet Alexander was undeterred. Where the sea separated him from his goal, he would build a road across it. Work began on a great causeway, a mole of stone, timber, and rubble stretching from the mainland to the island. The project was vast. Thousands of men labored, hauling stones from quarries, cutting down trees, driving piles into the seabed. Slowly, the road advanced into the water, a tongue of earth pushing out toward Tyre. From the city's walls, the Tyrians mocked and harassed the builders. They launched ships to attack the workers, hurling missiles and fire. They built new towers on their battlements, manned with archers and artillery. Day after day, the struggle continued, land pressing against sea, stone against wave. Progress was slow, and setbacks were severe. At one point, the Tyrians filled ships with combustible materials, set them ablaze, and drove them into the causeway. The flames spread to the wooden towers and shelters, reducing much of the work to ash. The sea reclaimed what men had built, and for a time the task seemed hopeless. Yet Alexander refused to abandon it. He ordered the causeway rebuilt, this time wider, stronger, more resistant to attack. He also summoned fleets from his newly conquered ports, Phoenician ships from Sidon and Byblos, Greek vessels from the Aegean. With each victory along the coast, his navy grew, until at last he could challenge Tyre at sea. Now the island was no longer impregnable. The Macedonian fleet blockaded its harbors, cutting off supplies, while the causeway advanced inexorably toward the walls. The siege dragged on for 7 months. It tested not only engineering, but endurance. The men toiled in the water, under constant fire from the walls above. The Tyrians fought fiercely, sallying out in ships, diving beneath the waves to sabotage foundations, devising every stratagem to slow their enemy. But Alexander pressed forward with relentless determination. Siege engines hurled stones at the walls, towers rolled forward on the causeway, ships brought up rams to batter the seaward defenses. Slowly, cracks appeared. The final assault came with overwhelming force. The fleet struck from multiple sides, while the causeway carried towers and rams to the walls. Macedonian soldiers, scaling ladders under a rain of missiles, clambered onto the battlements. Fighting was fierce, hand to hand, amid smoke, screams, and the thunder of collapsing stone. At last, the Macedonians broke through. The city was taken. What followed was brutal. Ancient accounts tell us that thousands of Tyrians were killed, and many more sold into slavery. The survivors who had sought refuge in the temples were dragged out. The scale of the destruction was immense. For Alexander, it was a calculated act, a warning to others who might defy him. Sidon and Byblos had surrendered and been spared. Tyre had resisted and been destroyed. The message could not have been clearer. Yet even in victory, Alexander recognized the value of Tyre's greatness. He ordered the city rebuilt and settled with new inhabitants, ensuring its harbor and trade would serve his empire. Tyre would rise again, but now under Macedonian rule. The siege of Tyre was one of the most remarkable feats of engineering in the ancient world. To build a half-mile causeway through the sea, under fire, and to breach walls rising sheer from the waves was a task many would have deemed impossible. It showcased Alexander's refusal to accept obstacles, his willingness to bend nature itself to his will. To his men, it was proof that no city, however proud or secure, could withstand their king. To his enemies, it was a chilling reminder that resistance would be met not only with defeat, but with devastation. The causeway itself endured. Over centuries, silt and sand collected around it until the island of Tyre became joined to the mainland permanently. Even today, the geography of the coast bears the mark of Alexander's determination. The sea that once protected Tyre now embraces it as part of the land, a monument in stone and earth to a siege fought more than 2,000 years ago. In the story of Alexander, Tyre stands as a turning point. It was not simply another conquest. It was the moment he demonstrated that nothing, not walls, not seas, not the defiance of ancient cities, could stand against his resolve. He had mastered men and armies, but at Tyre he seemed to master nature itself. And for those who followed him, whether companions, enemies, or chroniclers centuries later, the lesson was unforgettable. Alexander's ambition was not limited by what others thought possible. By the time Alexander marched into Egypt in late 332 BCE, his reputation had already spread far beyond Macedonia and Greece. He was the conqueror of the Granicus, the stormer of Halicarnassus, the breaker of Tyre. Yet in Egypt he was not met with battle, but with open gates, garlands, and hymns. The land that for millennia had been ruled by its own god-kings was weary of Persian satraps, weary of being a province in another man's empire. When Alexander came, they saw not an oppressor, but a liberator. Persian rule had left deep scars. Darius's predecessors had taxed heavily, interfered in temple revenues, and sometimes shown contempt for Egyptian religious traditions. To the Egyptians, whose lives revolved around the cycles of the Nile and the rites of their gods, this was sacrilege. Rebellions had flared again and again. Now, when a young conqueror arrived promising change, the people embraced him. Imagine Alexander's arrival at Pelusium, near the eastern mouth of the Nile, the air heavy with river mist, priests in white linen carrying sacred emblems, musicians with flutes and drums. Crowds gathered, voices raised in welcome, seeing in him not only a foreign king, but a pharaoh restored. To Alexander's companions, hardened by months of siege and battle, the reception must have felt like a dream. No arrows from the walls, no defenders on the battlements, only garlands and bread and wine. Alexander moved to Memphis, the ancient capital. There, in ceremonies older than Greece itself, he was crowned pharaoh. The priests of Ptah robed him, placed upon his head the double crown of Upper and Lower Egypt, and proclaimed him son of Ra. For Alexander, steeped in Greek notions of mortal kingship, this was a transformation. In Macedonia he was a monarch among men. In Egypt he was a god among mortals. The symbolism mattered. For the Egyptians, only a divine king could maintain Ma'at, the cosmic order that balanced heaven and earth, river and field, life and death. By accepting this role, Alexander claimed not only their loyalty, but their cosmology. He honored their gods in turn. He offered sacrifice to Apis, the sacred bull at Memphis, a living deity whose presence embodied the god Ptah. To worship Apis was to affirm continuity with thousands of years of pharaonic tradition. The priests, seeing him kneel before the bull, must have murmured approval. Here was no Persian despot mocking their gods, but a king who understood the rituals that bound the Nile to eternity. But Alexander was not content merely to wear the crown. He thought in terms of legacy. On the coast, near the island of Pharos, he surveyed a strip of land where the Nile met the sea. There he traced the outline of a new city, Alexandria. He imagined broad avenues crossing at right angles, markets filled with goods from every land, a great harbor where fleets could shelter, and a lighthouse to guide them. It would be a city of trade and learning, a beacon where Greek and Egyptian culture could meet. Alexander himself never lived to see it rise, but in his vision lay one of the most enduring creations of antiquity. For centuries, Alexandria would be a center of knowledge, home to its great library, a symbol that conquest was not only about armies, but about shaping the world's future. And yet, of all his deeds in Egypt, none was more mysterious than his journey into the desert, to the oracle of Ammon at Siwa. The decision to go there was deliberate. Ammon was a god whom the Greeks identified with Zeus, the father of gods and men. To be recognized by his oracle was to be granted divine legitimacy. And so Alexander set out, with only a small retinue, into the western desert. Picture the journey: endless sands stretching to the horizon, the sun burning down without mercy, the air shimmering in the heat. Caravans moved slowly, guided by stars at night and the sparse landmarks of oases by day. Ancient accounts speak of miraculous events: sudden rain that saved the travelers from thirst, or ravens flying overhead to guide their way. Whether these were true or later embellishments, they captured the sense of a march outside the ordinary, as if the desert itself acknowledged a chosen man. At last they reached Siwa, a small oasis of palms and springs, where amid the greenery stood the temple of Ammon. Its priests, robed and solemn, received the conqueror. Alexander entered the sanctuary, and what he heard inside was never fully revealed. Some said the oracle greeted him as son of Ammon, others that he asked whether all his father's murderers had been punished, and was answered that none could harm the son of a god. The words were ambiguous, as oracles often were, but Alexander came away convinced, or at least behaving as though convinced, that his divine status was confirmed. This moment has fascinated historians for centuries. Did Alexander truly believe he was the son of Zeus Ammon? Or did he cultivate the idea for political purposes? To the Greeks, the claim was extraordinary, even uncomfortable. To the Egyptians, it was natural, for every pharaoh was divine. To Alexander, perhaps, it was both truth and strategy. He had always modeled himself on heroes like Achilles and Heracles, figures who stood between mortal and divine. At Siwa, the line blurred further. The oracle's words followed him for the rest of his life. In later years, he demanded recognition not only as king, but as divine. To his companions, this was a source of tension, yet it reflected the transformation that had begun in Egypt. He was no longer content to be a man of destiny. He was becoming destiny embodied. When Alexander departed Egypt in the spring of 331 BCE, he left behind more than garrisons. He left a new city on the coast, a crown as pharaoh, a bond with the gods of the Nile, and a legend sanctified by the oracle of Siwa. Egypt embraced him, and in return he embraced Egypt, weaving its traditions into his growing empire. Ahead lay the heart of Persia, the confrontation with Darius himself. But behind him, in the desert oasis, the whisper of a god had told him he was more than mortal. By the autumn of 331 BCE, Alexander had marched thousands of miles from Macedonia to the very heart of the Persian Empire. He had crossed the Hellespont, fought at the Granicus, besieged Halicarnassus, cut the Gordian knot, stormed Tyre, and been crowned in Egypt. Each step had brought him closer to his true adversary, Darius III, the great king of Persia. Now, at last, the two would meet in open battle. Darius had not been idle since his defeat at Issus the year before. That loss, fought in the narrow passes of Cilicia, had been a humiliation. His army had been unable to use its numbers, his family captured by Alexander, his prestige badly damaged. This time, he resolved, the battle would be on his terms. He gathered a force that ancient sources describe in numbers so vast they strain belief. Some say 500,000 men, others more. Modern historians doubt such figures. But even if exaggerated, the Persian host was enormous, certainly far larger than Alexander's army of perhaps 47,000. Darius drew troops from across his empire: Persian cavalry, Babylonian infantry, Indian war elephants, Bactrian horsemen, Scythian archers, Armenian contingents, and Greek mercenaries. It was a patchwork of peoples, a mosaic of languages and customs, all bound together under the command of the great king. The battlefield he chose lay near the village of Gaugamela, on the plain east of the Tigris River. The ground was flat and wide, ideal for deploying cavalry and scythed chariots. Darius even ordered the land cleared and leveled to give his chariots free run. He believed this time his army's size and mobility would crush Alexander beyond escape. Alexander advanced from the west, his men hardened by years of campaigning. They had marched through deserts and mountains, besieged walls, crossed rivers under fire. They were fewer in number, but each man was a professional, drilled in the tactics Philip had forged and Alexander had perfected. Their king led from the front, not from a distant throne. The men trusted him, not only as a commander, but as a comrade. As the armies drew near, scouts reported the Persian host stretched across the horizon, its camp bristling with banners, its soldiers so numerous they seemed like a sea of spears. The Macedonians could see dust clouds rising in the distance, the glint of sunlight on armor, the rumble of wheels and hooves. It must have been a terrifying sight. Yet Alexander's response was calm. The night before the battle, Darius's camp was restless. Fires burned bright, orders shouted, soldiers uneasy. In Alexander's camp, all was still. The king, we are told, slept soundly, while his generals fretted. When asked how he could rest so peacefully before facing such numbers, he replied that he had already won, for the Persians had gathered all their strength in one place, and once defeated, nothing would remain to resist him. At dawn, the armies arrayed for battle. Darius placed himself at the center of his line, surrounded by his best cavalry and bodyguards. To his right and left stretched wings of cavalry, infantry, and chariots armed with scythed blades fastened to their wheels. Elephants, though few, added to the terror. The sheer scale of the Persian deployment dwarfed the Macedonian line. Alexander arranged his forces with precision. The phalanx, armed with their long sarissas, formed the center. Cavalry held the flanks, with Alexander himself commanding the companion cavalry on the right. Light infantry and skirmishers screened the front. He had arranged his men not to meet the Persians head-on, but to maneuver, to draw them out of position. He knew he could not match numbers. He had to outthink. The battle began with a thunder of hooves. Persian chariots charged, scythes whirring on their wheels, meant to slice through infantry like grass. But Alexander had prepared. His men opened gaps in their ranks, letting the chariots pass harmlessly through before closing in on the horses and drivers with javelins and spears. What was meant to be terror dissolved into chaos. Then the main clash erupted. Persian cavalry surged forward, pressing Alexander's flanks. Dust filled the air, arrows fell in showers, the clash of metal rang across the plain. Alexander's phalanx held the center, their long spears a bristling wall. But the Persians pressed hard, seeking to envelop the smaller force. It was at this moment that Alexander made his move. Leading the companion cavalry, he feigned retreat to the right, pulling part of his line with him. The Persians, seeing what they thought was weakness, poured cavalry into the gap, eager to envelop the Macedonians. But Alexander had lured them too far. With sudden precision, he wheeled back, formed a wedge with his companions, and drove straight at the Persian center, straight at Darius himself. The charge was thunderous, lances leveled, horses pounding the earth. The companions, elite among the elite, cut through the Persian line like an arrow. Alexander himself, conspicuous in shining armor, led the point. The Persian center wavered, then broke. Darius, seeing the charge bearing down upon him, lost his nerve. He turned his chariot and fled. The sight was fatal for Persian morale. If the king abandoned the field, what hope remained? Panic rippled through the ranks. Soldiers began to scatter. The vast host, which had seemed invincible, dissolved into rout. Yet the battle was not without danger for Alexander. On his left, the Macedonian line had been hard pressed, nearly encircled by the weight of Persian numbers. For a time they fought desperately, casualties mounting. Only when Alexander turned from pursuit and rushed to reinforce them did the crisis pass. His ability to be present where the battle was most critical saved his men from disaster. When the dust cleared, the field was a ruin. Persian dead littered the plain. Their chariots lay wrecked, their elephants scattered, their camp overrun. Macedonian losses were light in comparison. The royal tent of Darius fell into Alexander's hands, filled with treasures, luxuries, and the symbols of kingship. Darius himself escaped once more, but his authority was shattered. The victory at Gaugamela was decisive. The Persian Empire, which had ruled from the Aegean to the Indus, was broken. Babylon, Susa, and Persepolis would soon fall into Alexander's hands. From that day, there was no longer a great king in the eyes of the world. There was only Alexander. The battle has often been compared to Marathon, Salamis, and Plataea, the great Greek victories against Persia of an earlier age. But Gaugamela was more than vengeance for past invasions. It was the moment when the balance of power in the ancient world shifted completely. The age of Persia ended. The age of Alexander began. After Gaugamela, Darius fled eastward, but his empire was lost in all but name. Babylon opened its gates to Alexander, welcoming him with processions and garlands. Susa, with its immense treasuries, surrendered soon after. The Macedonians were stunned by the wealth they encountered: gold, silver, purple dyes, precious stones, more riches than their homeland had ever imagined. Yet all this was but a prelude to Persepolis. Persepolis was no ordinary city. Built by Darius I and embellished by his successors, it was the ceremonial capital of Persia, a place of kingship and ritual. The city sat on a great stone terrace, approached by monumental stairways carved with reliefs. Rows of tribute-bearers in sculpted procession adorned the walls: Medes, Babylonians, Egyptians, Indians, Scythians, all bringing gifts to the great king. At the heart of the complex stood the Apadana, the vast audience hall with its soaring columns. Nearby rose the palaces of Darius and Xerxes, their walls lined with intricate carvings, their doorways guarded by colossal winged bulls. To walk among these halls was to feel the weight of an empire that had ruled half the known world. When Alexander entered Persepolis in early 330 BCE, it was both triumph and desecration. The city's defenders resisted briefly, but Macedonian discipline and Persian disunity ensured the gates soon fell. What awaited inside was staggering. Treasure rooms groaned with bullion, according to ancient accounts, hundreds of tons of silver and gold ingots, coinage, and vessels. The wealth of centuries, stored in vaults, was now poured into Macedonian hands. For his soldiers, it was the climax of their long march. The empire they had come to conquer lay in their grasp. But Persepolis was more than wealth. It was symbol. To the Greeks, it was the heart of their old enemy, the empire that had once burned Athens. Here, at last, was the chance for vengeance. And so, after months in the city, Alexander staged one of the most debated acts of his career. According to the sources, a great banquet was held. Wine flowed freely, and among the guests was Thais, an Athenian courtesan. In the midst of revelry, she urged Alexander to avenge Greece by burning the Persian capital. Fired by drink, the king rose, garlanded his head, and with torch in hand set flame to the palace of Xerxes. Others followed. Torches passed from hand to hand until the wooden beams caught and flames leapt high into the night. The fire spread swiftly, devouring halls and roofs, consuming centuries of craftsmanship. The Apadana burned, its great columns silhouetted against the blaze. Reliefs blackened and cracked. Treasures melted. The city of kings became an inferno. The Macedonian soldiers, drunk and jubilant, danced amid the destruction. For them it was revenge for Marathon, Salamis, and Plataea. For Alexander, it was a gesture both theatrical and destructive, a conqueror showing the world that Persia was fallen. Yet not all approved. Some of his companions argued it was folly to destroy what could have become his own capital, folly to squander the majesty of conquest in drunken fire. Arrian, centuries later, would claim Alexander regretted it the next day, sobered and ashamed. Whether or not this remorse was genuine, the act revealed the contradictions within him. Builder and destroyer, patron of cities, yet burner of palaces. For the Persians, the burning of Persepolis was catastrophe. It was not merely a city lost, but a sacred center, a place where kings had communed with Ahura Mazda, their god of light and order. To see it in ruins was to feel that their world itself had ended. For Alexander's soldiers, however, it was triumph embodied, a spectacle of revenge, a memory that would never leave them. The ruins remained, silent and charred. Even today the broken columns of Persepolis stand under the Iranian sky, mute witnesses to that night of fire. To some, they speak of Alexander's hubris. To others, of his ruthless genius. In truth, they speak of both. The burning of Persepolis marked a turning point. Alexander had conquered Persia not only in fact, but in symbol. The empire of Cyrus, Darius, and Xerxes was no more. Its palaces were ash, its treasures scattered, its king fleeing eastward in desperation. Yet in destroying Persepolis, Alexander also destroyed something within himself. He was no longer merely avenger of Greece, he was overlord of Asia. From this point forward, his path would not be about revenge, but about ruling. and ruling required a different kind of wisdom. When the flames of Persepolis died down, and its treasures were loaded into Macedonian wagons, Alexander had reached a point most conquerors would have considered the pinnacle. He possessed Babylon, the richest city of Mesopotamia. He commanded Susa, with treasuries overflowing in bullion. He had walked through the palaces of Persepolis, reduced them to ash, and scattered their wealth among his men. The Persian Empire, once the terror of Greece, seemed to lie broken at his feet. And yet Alexander was unsatisfied, for the true center of Persia was not palaces or treasuries, but the person of the king. Darius III still lived. He fled eastward, gathering what loyalty he could from satraps and nobles. While he remained alive, the idea of Persia endured, fragile, but not extinguished. To leave him at large would be to risk rebellion behind Alexander's lines, a counterclaim that could undo all that had been won. So Alexander resolved to pursue. The march began in 330 BCE. The Macedonian army left the familiar valleys of Mesopotamia and climbed into the highlands of Media. The land changed with every step. Rolling plains gave way to harsh plateaus, wind-swept ridges, and mountains where winter snows lingered, even in summer's shadow. Villages clung to rivers, their fields a thin green against the vast brown of the land. Herds of horses and sheep grazed under the watch of nomads. For the Macedonians, this was no longer a war of brilliant set-piece battles. It was a march into distance, days of dust, nights of cold, endless horizons. Supply wagons creaked under the weight of treasure taken from Persepolis. Camp followers, craftsmen, and merchants trailed behind the columns. The army had grown not only in men, but in baggage, and every mile stretched thinner the thread of their discipline. Yet Alexander pushed them forward with relentless energy. Darius, meanwhile, struggled to hold his empire together. The great king who once commanded half the known world now moved as a fugitive. He appealed to the satraps of Bactria and Sogdiana, to eastern tribes who had scarcely felt the weight of Persian rule in generations. He promised gold, lands, honors, if they would rally. Some obeyed, bound by tradition, others wavered, calculating their survival. The aura of Persia had cracked, and in its place rose hesitation and betrayal. As Alexander advanced, he also reshaped his rule. In Media, he confirmed Persian satraps in office, but placed Macedonian officers beside them. He recruited cavalry from among the Medes, integrating them into his army. Already the lines between conqueror and ruler blurred. He was no longer simply a Greek king invading Persia. He was beginning to fashion himself as Persia's heir. He ordered respect for local customs, honored temples, and positioned himself not as destroyer, but successor. The pursuit of Darius was as much about optics as it was about capture. The chase grew more urgent with each report. Scouts brought news of Darius fleeing east, first into Parthia, then toward Bactria. He still carried the royal dignity, still issued commands, still sought to raise new armies. Alexander feared that if he allowed Darius to slip too far, the king might gather a force large enough to force another battle. And so the pace quickened. Macedonian columns marched long into the night. Dust clogged their throats, water grew scarce, and yet they pressed on, driven less by loyalty to Darius's capture than by fear of their king's displeasure. At last, the climax came. Word reached Alexander that Darius's own nobles had turned against him. Chief among them was Bessus, satrap of Bactria, a hard and ambitious man. Seeing no hope against Alexander, Bessus and others seized their king. They bound Darius, placing him in chains, and dragged him eastward. Their plan was to present him as a captive, bargaining for recognition, or, failing that, to eliminate him and seize power themselves. Alexander pursued with all speed. The chase was desperate now, across burning plains and narrow passes. When his vanguard finally overtook the Persian camp, they found devastation. The wagons were abandoned, tents ripped open, fires smoldering. And in a cart lay the great king, Darius, mortally wounded by his own men's javelins. The Macedonians lifted him, but he was beyond saving. Ancient writers tell us that when Alexander himself arrived, he found Darius still breathing. In some accounts, the dying king thanked him for his respect toward the royal family, begged him to avenge his murderers, and with his last breath entrusted his empire to the conqueror. Whether true or legend, the image mattered. Darius dying in Alexander's arms, the empire itself passing from one ruler to another. Alexander wept. He covered the king's body with his cloak and ordered him buried with full honors in a tomb befitting a Persian monarch. In doing so, he presented himself not as the slayer of Darius, but as his avenger. He condemned Bessus and swore pursuit. For Persians still loyal to their dynasty, this mattered deeply. The young Macedonian was no longer an outsider. He was protector of Persian kingship, heir to its dignity. Yet the reality was harsher. Darius's death meant Persia was truly conquered, its dynasty extinguished. The empire of Cyrus, Darius I, and Xerxes had ended not in glory, but in betrayal and blood. For Alexander's men, it was vindication. For Alexander, it was necessity fulfilled. But for the Persians, it was tragedy, the end of a world they had known for 2 centuries. The pursuit of Darius was not only a military chase, it was a transformation. In the dust of that wagon, Alexander ceased to be merely destroyer of Persia and became its master. His enemies were no longer Persian kings, but traitors like Bessus, and beyond them, the unconquered lands of Central Asia. The chase did not end the war. It only carried it into stranger, harsher, more distant places. After the death of Darius, Alexander's men expected their long war to be nearly at an end. They had marched across Asia Minor. They had faced the great king at Issus and again at Gaugamela, and they had watched their enemies scatter. Babylon and Susa had surrendered. Persepolis itself, the pride of Persia, had fallen and burned. What more could there be? The empire was taken. The foe was defeated. To many, the path home should have been open. But Alexander's vision was not bound by their expectations. The empire was not secure while rebellions flared, while satraps in distant provinces clung to their power, while new kings arose in defiance. And so, when Darius fell by the hand of his own men, Alexander did not turn westward. He pressed on, eastward, into lands that most Greeks had never seen on a map, let alone marched through. The road into Bactria and Sogdiana was no ordinary road. The army crossed mountains where the air thinned and the peaks were streaked with white, even in midsummer. They traversed deserts where the sun scorched the earth by day and the cold froze their bones by night. Rivers swelled with glacial melt had to be crossed on rafts of skins, horses swimming beside their riders, baggage wagons dragged through currents that threatened to sweep them away. Each day the horizon seemed to stretch farther, the land growing stranger and more distant from the Mediterranean world they had left behind. For Alexander, these marches were not a burden, but an opportunity. Every new landscape was a canvas for conquest, every tribe another chance to expand the borders of his empire. For his men, however, it was weariness without end. They had fought for years already, and now they found themselves chasing enemies who refused to meet them in pitched battle. Instead of great fields like Gaugamela, they found raids and ambushes. Instead of a king on a throne, they found satraps and chieftains, hidden in fortresses that clung like eagles' nests to the sides of cliffs. The enemy they pursued most immediately was Bessus, the satrap of Bactria, who had betrayed Darius. When the great king fell, it was Bessus who had bound him in chains, Bessus who had abandoned him to die in a wagon, Bessus who had seized the royal name and dared to call himself Artaxerxes, King of Kings. He hoped the East would rally to him, that the mountains and steppes would shield him from Alexander's advance. But Bessus found that betrayal bred only suspicion. When Alexander's army drew near, his allies lost faith. They bound him as he had once bound Darius, and delivered him in chains to the Macedonian king. His punishment was made public and severe. He was scourged, mutilated, and executed in front of Persian nobles. The message was clear. Alexander didn't reward treachery, even when it served his cause. To Persians, he cast himself as heir of Darius, protector of royal honor. To his own men, he was avenger and judge, dispensing justice across the empire. Yet Bessus's death did not end the struggle. In Sogdiana, the resistance was fiercer still. These were not Persians loyal to Darius, but tribes who had never bowed willingly to any empire. They fought from strongholds in the mountains, striking like falcons and vanishing before the Macedonians could catch them. Their fortresses perched on heights so steep that the soldiers called them rocks, as if the mountains themselves had turned against them. Sieges here were unlike those at Tyre or Halicarnassus. There were no great walls to batter down with engines, no harbors to blockade. Instead, there were cliffs to climb, icy slopes to scale, ladders lashed from ropes swaying in the wind. Arrows whistled down from above, stones tumbled onto helmets and shields. Many soldiers slipped and fell, dashed on the rocks below. And yet Alexander was always there, climbing with his men, showing them that no danger was beneath him. His presence turned despair into courage, and again they took fortresses that seemed unassailable. The war was slow, exhausting, and thankless. There were no overflowing treasuries here, no palaces filled with gold. Victories brought only more marching, more rebels to pursue, more mountains to cross. Around their campfires at night, the men muttered about home. Some had been away for nearly a decade. They had missed harvests, weddings, children's births. They looked at their king and saw not the companion who had once ridden beside them, but a man increasingly remote, dressed in Persian robes, expecting obeisance, speaking of visions larger than they could grasp. For Alexander himself was changing. He no longer thought in terms of Greece and Persia, Macedonian and barbarian. He began to think in terms of one empire, one people. He adopted Persian customs, not abandoning his own, but blending them. He invited Persians into his councils, placed local nobles in charge of provinces, and recruited Persian cavalry into his army. His men grumbled, but Alexander pressed forward. His empire could not rest on Macedonian spears alone. It needed the loyalty of those it had conquered. It was in these eastern lands that one of the most famous moments of his personal life occurred. In a captured fortress in Sogdiana, Alexander met Roxana, daughter of a nobleman named Oxyartes. She was said to be strikingly beautiful, and Alexander took her not as a concubine, but as a wife. To the Macedonians, it was shocking. Their king, who might have married into Macedonian nobility, had chosen a bride from among the very people they had been fighting. To Alexander, it was both personal and political. By marrying Roxana, he bound himself to the local aristocracy, transforming an enemy's daughter into his queen. To the Sogdians, it was a powerful gesture. The conqueror had not merely subdued them, but joined them. The marriage symbolized the larger vision forming in Alexander's mind. His men might see themselves as Macedonians conquering foreigners, but Alexander dreamed of a single empire, united not by bloodshed alone, but by bonds of kinship, culture, and marriage. Roxana was the first sign of this, but not the last. In time, he would encourage his officers to marry Persian women, seeking to weave a fabric of empire stronger than arms alone. Still, beneath the gestures of unity, the fighting dragged on. Fortress after fortress, winter after winter, the Macedonians climbed, fought, and endured. They stormed one stronghold so high that when the defenders surrendered, they did so in awe, unable to believe men could climb walls that were cliffs. In another, Alexander scaled icy crags alongside his men, showing that no height, no hardship would stop him. His legend grew not only as a commander of battles, but as a man who turned the impossible into the inevitable. The cost was deep. Men froze, starved, and fell in lands that offered little reward. Morale faltered, resentment festered. Some whispered that their king was no longer one of them, that he was more Persian than Macedonian, that he sought not glory for Greece but something stranger, a world without boundaries, ruled by himself alone. And yet, through weariness and bitterness, they followed. For Alexander's presence burned too brightly to resist. He had led them across seas and deserts, through victories that seemed beyond belief. However much they muttered, when he called, they marched. In the mountains of Sogdiana, Alexander's transformation became clear. He was no longer simply the young king who had tamed Bucephalus, nor the conqueror who had cut the Gordian knot. He was no longer the avenger of Greece against Persia. He was becoming something greater and more alien, an emperor of many peoples, a man shaping a new order that blended East and West, Greek and barbarian, soldier and noble, king and god. For his soldiers, this was a time of trial, the hardest years of their long campaign. For Alexander, it was the crucible in which his vision of empire was forged. And in those harsh valleys and icy peaks, amid raids and rebellions, the boy who had once ridden across the plains of Macedonia was remade into a ruler who saw the world itself as his horizon. When Alexander resolved to march into India, it was not a decision made lightly, nor one his men welcomed. To them, Persia was already conquered. Babylon, Susa, Persepolis, all had fallen. Darius was dead, his betrayer punished. They had marched farther than any Greek or Macedonian had ever dreamed. Yet for their king, it was not enough. The maps of the Greeks were hazy, but they spoke of rich lands beyond the Hindu Kush, of rivers as broad as seas, of elephants that fought like living towers. Alexander longed to see these wonders, to claim them, to press on, until there was no horizon left unconquered. The crossing of the Hindu Kush was a torment. These mountains were higher than any the Macedonians had faced. The air grew thin, every breath a struggle. Snow blinded their eyes, winds cut through their cloaks, and frostbite gnawed at fingers and toes. Horses slipped on icy paths, wagons toppled into ravines, soldiers collapsed in the cold and did not rise again. Nights were cruel, men huddling together for warmth, listening to the howl of the wind. Supplies dwindled, for the land gave little, only thin grass for the animals, only sparse firewood gathered at great cost. Yet Alexander, as always, pressed forward, riding at the head, sharing the hardships. His presence was the only fire that kept the army moving. At last they descended from the frozen heights into the Indus Valley, and the change was like passing from one world to another. The air grew heavy and warm. The land turned green, thick with crops and palms. Rivers branched and rejoined, the soil rich from flooding. Birds filled the trees, and animals unfamiliar to the soldiers moved in the fields. After years of deserts and plateaus, the lushness of India seemed a paradise. But paradise was guarded, and not all welcomed the strangers. The first encounters were mixed. Some rulers sent envoys bearing gifts, cattle, gold, fine textiles, hoping to avoid destruction. Others resisted. Towns were fortified, warriors defended their fields with poisoned arrows, and in one siege the Macedonians discovered that defenders would rather burn their homes than surrender. For the soldiers, these battles were strange and unnerving. The weapons were different, the tactics unfamiliar. They saw war elephants for the first time, towering beasts armored in bronze, tusks sharpened, riders perched high above. The sight alone shook their courage. Horses shied away, sensing their power. Men whispered of monsters rather than animals. Alexander studied these creatures carefully. He knew they were not invincible, but he also knew the terror they inspired. To defeat elephants would not only be a victory of arms, but of morale. His chance came when he marched to the Hydaspes River, where King Porus awaited him. Porus was a formidable foe, tall, proud, and commanding an army seasoned in war. He positioned himself on the far bank of the river, his elephants interspersed among his infantry, his cavalry massed on the wings. The Hydaspes itself was no gentle stream. Swollen by rains, it surged broad and swift, its current dangerous, its waters deep. To cross it in daylight, under the eyes of Porus and his beasts, was unthinkable. So Alexander turned to deception. Day after day he marched his men up and down the river bank, feinting as though to cross. Porus shadowed him, moving his forces to match. At night, campfires burned along the shore, keeping the illusion alive. Then, in the dark hours before dawn, Alexander moved silently upstream with a chosen force. Rain lashed them, the river roared, and still they waded in. Men clung to rafts of hides, horses swam beside them, officers whispered commands over the rush of the water. By the time Porus realized what had happened, Alexander had crossed with enough troops to strike. The battle was savage. Porus's cavalry charged, only to be met and repelled by Alexander's companions. The elephants advanced, their trumpeting shaking the ground, their tusks sweeping men aside. Macedonian spears struck again and again, but the beasts pressed on, crushing men beneath their feet, tossing horses into the air. Some elephants, maddened by wounds, turned in panic, trampling their own ranks. The air was filled with screams of men and animals, the crash of weapons, the blare of trumpets. At the center, Porus fought with kingly valor, standing high on his own elephant, directing his men with dignity even as the tide turned against him. He was wounded, surrounded, yet wouldn't yield until he could fight no more. Brought before Alexander, bleeding but unbowed, he was asked how he wished to be treated. His answer, "Like a king," struck Alexander deeply. In that simple phrase lay all the pride and dignity of a ruler who had fought to the last. Alexander, moved, spared him, restoring his kingdom and making him an ally rather than a captive. The cost of victory was heavy. Many Macedonians lay dead, trampled or gored. Horses had fled in terror, never to be regained. The men were shaken, not only by the ferocity of the fight, but by the realization that their king's ambition would drag them still farther east. Rumors spread of yet greater armies beyond the Ganges, of more elephants, of lands without end. Around the campfires, voices grew louder, asking how long they must march, how far they must go before it was enough. Alexander, however, still dreamed of reaching the edge of the world. He spoke of marching to the ocean, of planting Macedonian standards where no Greek had ever stood. His men listened in silence, their loyalty stretched thin. At the Hyphasis River, when he ordered the advance to continue, they refused. The refusal was not loud rebellion, but a quiet wall of will. They would go no farther. They had followed him across deserts, over mountains, into battles against foes who seemed invincible. They had given their blood, their youth, their very lives. But the horizon, they said, could not be conquered forever. Alexander raged. He sulked in his tent for days, refusing to see them. He threatened, he pleaded, he prayed, but the army would not bend. At last, with tears in his eyes, he accepted the limit. He ordered altars built on the river bank, sacrifices made to the gods, as though to mark the edge of his reach. Then he turned his army back. The retreat was no gentle journey. As they marched down the Indus, tribes resisted fiercely. At the city of the Malians, Alexander himself led the assault, scaling a wall and leaping inside. He was struck by an arrow deep in his chest, the shaft nearly killing him. His men fought desperately to reach him, dragging him back from death's edge. For days he lay near lifeless, and rumors spread that he had died. When he finally rose, pale but alive, the army erupted in relief. His survival seemed a miracle, a sign that fate still shielded him. Along the Indus, Alexander built a fleet. Nearchus, one of his trusted officers, prepared to sail to the ocean and explore its coasts. Some of the army marched beside the river, others embarked on ships, drifting down the broad waters, marveling at sights they had never known. In time they reached the sea itself, where waves stretched to the horizon, and Alexander sacrificed to the gods of the ocean, believing he had touched the boundary of the earth. The return westward was brutal. Part of the army was sent through the Gedrosian desert, a wasteland of sand and stone. The heat was merciless, water scarce. Men collapsed by the thousands, animals perished, wagons were abandoned. Only a fraction survived. For the soldiers, it was a torment they would never forget. For Alexander, it was proof again that he would endure what his men endured, walking beside them under the same burning sun. By the time they emerged from the desert and rejoined the fleet, the army was exhausted, diminished, and hardened beyond measure. They had marched to the edge of the world and back, and though their bodies bore the scars of suffering, their memories carried the weight of triumph. They had seen what no Macedonian had seen before: the elephants of India, the broad rivers, the ocean itself. For Alexander, India was both pinnacle and limit. It was his farthest reach, his greatest test, and the moment when ambition met the immovable wall of human endurance. He had won, yet he had also been denied. His men would follow him into hell itself, but not into infinity. And in that truth lay the shadow of what was to come, when king and army would no longer share the same dream. On the march through Carmania, after the terrible crossing of the Gedrosian waste, where so many had fallen in the sand, Alexander staged a procession that felt like a spell against the memory of thirst. Wreaths of vine and ivy, music in the heat, a deliberate echo of Dionysus, as if to declare that mortals could survive what gods once wandered. The men drank and sang, the dust rising around them like incense. It was a performance, yes, but also a release of breath the army had been holding for months. There are moments in long campaigns when the soldiers need a sign that they are more than beasts of burden. This was one of them, and the sight of their king walking among them with loosened reins and garlands in his hair was a balm. They came at last to Susa, the city of treasuries, the city of polished floors and long shade, where gold still seemed to pour from storehouses without end. Here Alexander showed that conquest and administration were now the same road. He announced the repayment of his soldiers' debts from the royal chest, a gesture that landed like rain on parched ground. Men who had borrowed to equip themselves years before felt a weight lift from their backs. He reappointed satraps, added Macedonian overseers to Persian governors, and began again the work that had started in Media and deepened in Bactria: blending. In Susa he also staged a ceremony that startled his Macedonians and pleased his Persian nobles: mass marriages, Greek and Macedonian officers to Persian brides, 100 and more couples, garlands and singers, and gifts for each. At the center, Alexander and Roxana stood as living proof that the policy he preached was not for others only. To the Persians, it meant inclusion, honor, continuity. To many Macedonians, it felt like subtraction, something of themselves diluted into an empire they had won with their blood. The strain beneath the splendor had been tightening for years. There had been the night in Maracanda, when, over wine and flatteries and the old quarrels that never quite sleep, Cleitus the Black had taunted his king with the memory of Philip and the victories of another generation. Words sharpened. Pride, that restless horse, broke its bridle. Alexander's hand found a spear, and in an instant that would never be forgotten, he killed the man who had once saved his life on the banks of the Granicus. The silence after was longer than a night. It stretched into the years that followed, a weight that sat behind every feast. He tried to make amends to the ghost with grief and fasting, but the deed did not untie itself. It lived beside him, a shadow in bright rooms. There had been, too, the quarrel over obeisance, the act of prostration before the king that Persians offered as a natural courtesy to majesty, and the Macedonians would not. To old companions who had shared tents and dust with their king, the idea of kneeling as if before a god felt like betrayal of the equality the campaign had bred among them. A court historian who resisted the ritual found himself out of favor and then in chains. Stories would later say he died in custody, a cautionary tale passed in a whisper. With each ceremony that folded Persian custom into Macedonian practice, a thread frayed somewhere deeper in the army's cloth. Then came Opis on the Tigris, where Alexander announced that some veterans, aged and wounded, could return home with honors and gifts, and that new Persian units, the young men he had trained in Macedonian fashion, would take their place in the ranks. He meant it as reward and as proof of his fusion policy. The old soldiers heard dismissal under the music and gold. They shouted that they were all dismissed then, that he could campaign with his father, meaning the Persian god he had claimed in Egypt. Anger washed the ranks, a hard tide that could have broken anything it struck. Alexander strode into their midst without guards, the way he always had when danger was thickest, and seized a handful of ringleaders himself. He spoke, not as a distant monarch, but as the man who had crossed rivers with them and bled beside them, of their victories, of the miles they had walked together, of the share they had in everything he had built. The fury cooled, and with it came something like shame. The mutiny dissolved into tears, embraces, a feast of reconciliation. Gifts were distributed. The veterans named kinsmen, sent home resplendent in bronze and purple, carrying the story that even at the end of the earth they had stood face to face with their king and spoken their minds and gone away, honored. For all the policy and spectacle, the empire's center was in a person, and that person had a heart that beat for people as fiercely as for ambition. Hephaestion had been with Alexander since the grove at Myetza, a friend so close that later ages could not help but compare them to the Homeric pair they had honored at Troy. In Ecbatana, as the army settled into winter quarters, Hephaestion sickened after a fever and a misjudged meal. The physicians could do nothing. He died quickly, and with him went the one presence that had walked beside Alexander from youth through every corner of the world. The conqueror who had faced elephants and deserts with an iron face was unmade by grief. He cut his hair in mourning, as Achilles had on the shore of the Scamander. He ordered shrines and sacrifices, closed the music and laughter of the camp, and planned a funeral that would burn in memory as bright as any city he had taken. A pyre as high as a hill, statues, colonnades, carvings, all to lift his friend to the status of a hero. He sent envoys across the empire to ask the oracles and the cities to recognize Hephaestion's new honor. Some thought it too much. Most saw only a man who had lost the anchor of his life. After that winter, everything sounded louder. Plans, orders, the rustle of maps. Alexander spoke of Arabia, of a fleet to circle its coasts and harbors carved from the banks of the Euphrates, of canals to tame the waters and sweep silt from the channels, of a ring of cities to clasp the empire like a necklace. Shipwrights bent over timbers, sailors drilled under the eye of Nearchus, engineers measured and sketched. Babylon, with its hanging gardens and wide processional ways, would be a capital suited to a world that flowed into it from all directions. Envoys arrived from Italy, from Libya, from the Black Sea and the Caspian, from places that lay only as rumors on older maps. Some brought gifts, others treaties, others only the respectful curiosity that one gives to a rising star, the sense that gravity had shifted, and every road bent a little toward the city where the young king planned his next reach. He returned to Babylon in the spring, and the city, with its warm river breezes and its palms, felt like a place where a new beginning could be written. He received ambassadors. He walked the banks and spoke to the engineers. He made offerings to the gods of the land. He listened to plans for a great harbor that would cradle a fleet capable of rounding Arabia and perhaps beyond. The army swelled with new recruits from the east, trained in Macedonian drill, eager to prove themselves under their famous commander. The veterans who remained adjusted to the sight of Persians in their files, to the cadence of commands shouted in several tongues, to the idea that the line could bend without breaking if men kept step together. In the evenings, music drifted from the palace. In the mornings, the sun burned through mist over the river. In the afternoons, scribes moved like current through corridors with tablets of clay impressed by seals that now bore both Greek and Persian shapes. The end arrived without heralds, the way the most important turns of life often do. During a series of feasts held for returning officers and envoys, Alexander drank as he always had, too much for a body that had endured deserts, wounds, and sleepless years. A fever took hold. At first it was dismissed as heat, as the ordinary chill that follows nights of wine, as the kind of stiffness that leaves a man after a day back in the saddle. He continued to meet, to plan, to dream aloud about ships and harbors and the new arse of the empire. Then the fever deepened. He sweated through the nights and woke weaker, his voice rough with thirst. He sacrificed to the gods and asked for omens. He ordered the plans for the fleet reviewed again. He received his generals even as attendants brought cool cloths and wine cut with water. On the last days, when the fever had him firmly, the soldiers, who had heard whispers that the king was dying and could not bear a second rumor of a loss after the first had proved false in India, begged to see him. The officers arranged it. The army filed past, column after column, through the still room where Alexander lay. He could not speak, but he raised his hand to each in turn, a gesture that felt like a seal pressed into wax. Men wept openly, not because they loved soft things, but because they had learned in hard places what it meant to belong to something larger than themselves. There are stories about his last words. Some said that when asked to whom he left the empire, he whispered, "To the strongest," a phrase that fell like a hammer into a room full of iron. Others said he spoke only of great funeral games to be held in his honor, as if he knew that his passing would loose contests across the world no athlete could match. He removed his signet ring and handed it to Perdiccas, a gesture that might mean trust or command, or both. Then the fever carried him beyond the reach of decisions. He was 32 years old, with more behind him than most kingdoms lived to see, and more ahead of him on the map than any one man could finish. The news spread through Babylon like a wind that slams doors and leaves houses echoing. In the palaces, officers met and did not agree. In the streets, people spoke softly in fear that the wrong word would be overheard by the wrong ear. In the camps, men sat with their heads in their hands, and the old stories of his courage, how he had turned a terrified horse toward the sun, how he had crossed rivers in armor, how he had climbed ice and stone with bare fingers, ran again like bread through hungry minds. The army needed a center. The empire needed a name at its apex. There were two, the child in Roxana's body, not yet born, and the half-brother who lacked a king's mind. For a season, the name at the top would be a pair joined by hyphen and council. In truth, the scepter fell into many hands at once. The body was not taken to Macedonia. Ptolemy, who had been a companion since the days when the boys in Myetza learned Aristotle's letters under the trees, claimed it and diverted the funerary train to Egypt, the land where Alexander had been crowned a god's son, and where a city named for him had begun to glow like a lighthouse in the imagination of traders and scholars. There, in time, the tomb became a place of pilgrimage, a point where kings could lay wreaths and feel that something of greatness rubbed off on their fingers. Babylon remained Babylon, but Alexandria began to tell time by its own noon. What followed were the wars that his last indecipherable bequest had promised. Generals who had once fought shoulder to shoulder now measured each other by distance rather than friendship. They called themselves guardians and regents, then kings, then something larger than kings. The maps were redrawn in every decade. Somewhere in those storms, Roxana's child, Alexander's namesake, flickered like a candle in a wind too strong to be kind. The empire he had been born to was parceled before he could read its shape. The cities Alexander had founded kept breathing, though. Alexandria in Egypt most of all. Then the other Alexandrias, strewn like bright beads along roads and rivers. Greek language and thought braided themselves into the lives of peoples who had never seen the Aegean, and local gods learned new names without giving up their old faces. The Hellenistic world, as later historians would call it, began not in fanfare, but in the quiet arithmetic of markets and marriages, garrisons and schools, the slow habit by which neighbors become communities. If one stands back from the detail, the treaties and sieges, the coins with their new heads, the proclamations pressed into clay, what remains is a shape any sleeping mind can travel along. A boy in Pella learns to read Homer and to wrestle with logic under the trees at Myetza. He tames a horse by understanding fear. He inherits a throne in a world that does not want to be ruled by him, then makes it so. He crosses a narrow sea and declares a continent spear won. And because he believes it, others do. He splits a knot in a place where stories have weight, throws bridges of timber into the ocean to reach a city that thought itself an island forever, kneels in a temple where the desert holds its breath, and comes out believing that his blood belongs to the gods. He breaks the back of an empire on a plain leveled for chariots, burns a palace that once glowed like the idea of kingship, and then spends years learning that empires are made not only by battles, but by the patience to climb winter cliffs and the courage to tell old friends that the world they fought to win will not look the way they imagined. He rides into India to find a king who can look him level from the back of an elephant and a river that teaches him limits. He returns through deserts where even memory dries, and he reaches a city of gardens where plans for ships and harbors fill the air like birds. He dies before any plan leaves the water. The echo of his steps does not die with him. Sometimes, when the night is very quiet, the story can be heard, as it must have sounded to the men who told it, around fires after the marching was done. It is not the sound of trumpets or the clash of bronze, but the softer rhythm of breath and voice. A horse turned toward the sun, a spear lifted at a riverbank while arrows hissed, a city built where two worlds meet, a friend's name spoken into cold air and answered by silence, a hand lifted from a bed as long files of men pass by for the last time. The world that followed was stranger and more mixed than the one that came before, and whether that is a blessing or a warning depends on who is remembering. But even for those who can't love conquest, there is this: the knowledge that limits are real, that they are found not on maps, but in the lives of men. The river is too broad to cross, and building an altar on the bank to mark the place. In the cities he founded, children learned letters in new alphabets. In villages he never saw, poets sang of him like a star that had passed overhead and lit the night for a moment. Philosophers argued about empire and virtue, and the good life in markets that sold dates from Mesopotamia and spices from the east. Sailors followed coasts that Nearchus had charted when the world was still young in their minds. Somewhere in Asia, a stone still bears a Greek name scratched by a soldier who thought to prove to the future that he had been there, that he had stood where the mountains met the sky and felt that sky close enough to touch. If you listen long enough, the noise falls away. What remains is the quiet of a map unrolled on a table and a hand resting on it, not in possession, but in wonder. The hand belongs to a boy before he is a king, and to a king before he is a legend. The map is the world, as his teachers drew it, fragmentary, inaccurate, here be monsters, in the margins and rivers that wander the wrong way. He adds to it, line by line, not always wisely, not always mercifully, but with a devotion to the act of drawing that overtakes everything else. Others will shade and label and correct. Others will tear the parchment and stitch it to new sheets. But the first sweep of ink that joins the Aegean to the Indus, the courage or folly that presses a pen where no one has pressed it before, that is his. And for that alone, the night keeps telling his name, softly, as people drift into sleep, somewhere between history and dream.